Have you ever wondered why some watercolor paintings feel like you can walk right into them and others feel really flat? Well, the answer is all about perspective. So I'm going to do a whole series of videos on watercolor and perspective. And this first one, we're going to dive in with atmospheric perspective. So first off, what is atmospheric perspective? It is also called aerial perspective sometimes, and it's using the color, the intensity, and the values of your different watercolor paints to create a sense of depth. And then we also look at like edge control and the level of details. And by shifting those things throughout the scene, you can create that sense of depth without even looking at other types of perspective. So this is kind of the basic perspective theories that you want to then include in your future paintings, whether you're just relying on aerial or atmospheric perspective, or whether you're pulling in some of the techniques that we're going to talk about further in this series. So atmospheric perspective is all about how we perceive distance. So our eyes, we can't really actually perceive three-dimensional space. We're seeing objects and our brain is interpreting that as three-dimensional space. And with that, basically the atmosphere itself has an impact on how we see objects and how they appear to us. So we have that song, with Purple Mountains Majesty. Well, the mountains aren't actually purple, but because of the atmospheric effect on distant mountains, they appear more purple or violet or blue versus, if they're actually gray or browns or warmer colors. They have that subtle shift in color temperature toward those cooler values. So if you are painting, then in the distance, in your background, typically you're going to want your value or your colors to be cooler in temperature. Whereas as they come forward in the scene, they're going to be warmer. Another part of this is intensity. So as distance increases, we cannot perceive color as precisely. So the colors become more muted. They become less intense. So you're going to want to play with that and keep your foreground items as the most intense colors, your most pure pigments. So your brightest yellows, your brightest reds, your brightest blues even. And then as you go back in the painting, they're going to get more muted as well as cooler in temperature. Then we look at the value. So again, as distance increases, the atmosphere has an effect of decreasing the value. So things that are farther off in the distance, they're going to have a lighter value typically. And they're also going to have less contrast between values. So up close, we can perceive those sharp contrasts in light and dark. But in the distance, it all sort of starts to blend together. So we can use all of those principles to build depth in our paintings. Then we look at edge control and details. These kind of go hand in hand. So in watercolor, when we're painting details, usually they're going to have hard, sharp edges, right? And when we're painting things that are softer or out of focus, it's going to have softer edges or even lost edges where you're not really seeing where one thing starts and the other thing ends. So you're going to play with that in your painting as well. Things in the distance you're not going to perceive as clearly. So you want to paint them that way. So the distance are going to be using your techniques such as wet on wet, where you're not going to get a sharp edge. And then once you move to the foreground, you can play with those techniques also, but you're going to want to include some harder edges. So you're looking at wet on dry, or you're building texture. So you're looking at things like dry brushing or your different techniques, stippling type of techniques to create texture in the foreground. Keeping those details in the foreground is going to be one of those things that helps to push that distance. So the other thing to think about is you're not going straight from foreground with all the details, all the intensity, all the high contrast in values and the warmer temperatures straight to background, right? So the foreground is going to have all of those things. The background is going to be the opposite, but there has to be a transition in the middle, or else it's just going to look like you stacked two paintings on top of each other and they're not going to flow. So that middle distance, it's the midground. It's really important, and it's that transition between those differences. So your midground is going to have more of your middle values. It's going to have some contrast, but not as much as your foreground. It's going to have maybe some intense colors, and then as you're moving back toward the background, that intensity is decreasing. And it's that shift from more warm colors through more neutral toward cool colors. So that is kind of how we build the painting. And it is really like building a composition, right? So we'll look at a few examples of these now. So the first example that we're going to look at is John Singer Sargent and the Hay Wain. And this is a historical painting that uses very classic atmospheric perspective. So you can see in the foreground, kind of the bottom left of the painting, we have our very warm colors, our kind of reddish tones, our oranges, our browns. And as we move back in the scene, those tones, those color temperatures shift and become cooler, and you're looking at more of your blues and your violets. We also have our difference in intensity. So our kind of brightest, purest colors, again, are in this foreground space. And that really also helps to kind of highlight the focal points there in the foreground. And then as we move back, there is color intensity still. It's not like they're just grays or muted colors completely, but they're less intense colors and they're less contrast with each other too. So you have the sky and the background mountains. There is decent amount of intensity in the colors, but they're not contrasting colors next to each other. They're more like analogous colors that are next to each other. So it's not pulling your eye straight there. It's keeping it in the background. And then you have, all of the details. So really the background is just loose, larger brush strokes. And as it moves toward the foreground, it becomes much more detailed and a lot more obvious painting of certain items and certain textures versus the background. The next example we're going to look at is Adam Bierstadt. I'm probably pronouncing that wrong. I'm sure I'm pronouncing that wrong. But he painted this painting that is among the Sierra Nevada mountains, California. And I'm obsessed with Yosemite and the national parks in California. I think they're beautiful. So this one really, I like this painting a lot. But you can see how he uses atmospheric perspective to create that depth and distance. There's not a lot of, there's not buildings and things like that, things are obviously closer and then get smaller farther away, that kind of thing. But you can see just by how he shifts the color temperatures, the intensities, the values, and the detail, the level of detail, it creates that sense of depth. And this one really highlights the values. So down toward the bottom of the painting is the foreground, and the values are very dark and intense values. And then as it moves toward the background, you see that light coming through this mist or this fog, and it really points to that distant background. It's that lighter value, it's pushed back, and that fog also gives that kind of an easy way to mask any details. And so that's a really simple technique to help to create distance in your paintings. If you're doing a landscape, for example, is to go ahead and create that kind of soft, misty background, because then you don't even have to think about, well, should I add more details or anything like that? It's already done. It's already misty, and it reads as distance. So again, similar ideas, but just a slightly different example. And I think this one highlights the values a lot better than the last one. So a few times where you might want to very intentionally use atmospheric perspective in watercolor paintings, kind of where it really shines, is really in your landscapes. So your misty mountain scenes, your seascapes, your forest scenes, all of these are going to lend themselves really well to application of atmospheric perspective principles. You can also use it in cityscapes and especially like misty scenes or rainy scenes is really going to help to pull that out. And atmospheric perspective is one of those things that actually is going to be layered over the rest of our series here in the videos, because even when you're looking at some of the other types of perspective that we'll get into, 1 point, 2 point, 3 point, all of those things, you're typically going to layer in atmospheric perspective into your paintings to help push that depth. So now we're going to jump into a very simple demo. This is not going to be a completed painting by any means. And so I'm just going to get my sketchbook out here and I'm going to wake up my paints. I need to find my spray bottle. And then we're just going to do a really simple scene that demonstrates atmospheric perspective. Let me go find my spray bottle. Okay, I'm back. So I'm just going to spray down my paints. Get them all nice and wet. This is going to be a very quick, loose scene, and I'm just going to use a size 10 round brush. These are Degato artist brushes. They are nice. I like them. They don't shed a lot. They're not expensive, so definitely recommend them. Now, if you don't understand color, that is fairly important for atmospheric perspective, and I have a whole series on color theory for watercolor artists, so you can always go and check that out, and I'll make sure to put a link to that playlist in the description. But here we're not going to get into all of the color theory behind this, but we're just going to start. Okay, so first we're going to look at some different techniques, right? So we want our background to be out of focus and fuzzy and not detailed. So we're gonna start wet on wet. So I'm just putting a puddle of water on this section, and I'm gonna kind of do a little, I'm not gonna do the whole page here. I'm just doing a square. I might do actually half of the page. I'll just kind of make a rectangle here. Okay, adding lots of water because I want it to stay wet while I'm going through these first few layers, okay? So just kind of checking for the sheen on my paper, making sure that it's evenly wet. Okay, now I'm gonna start, we're just gonna do a really simple scene with a sky, some mountains, some trees, and then kind of like a field in the front, just to demonstrate. Okay, so I'm just gonna start with some blue, and I'm taking some cerulean blue here, and this is my sky, okay? Now, with this, we're doing wet on wet so that we get soft transition between things, okay? So I'm pulling this wash down beyond where the sky is gonna end. Okay. I'm not making a hard edge. So this is where edge control comes in. In general, you want to think about painting each edge only once. So there, I am not painting the edge of the sky. I'm just letting it bleed down into the rest of the painting. And then I'm going to go in and put in some mountains. So we're going to use our cerulean blue still, which is a, relatively cool color. It's on the blue side. And I'm going to add just a tiny bit of pink into that to make them purple. And I'm going to make this a limited palette. So that's a thing that can always help your paintings look cohesive, is to use a limited palette. So I'm using cerulean, I'm using permanent rose, and I haven't decided what else yet. But so far, just cerulean and permanent rose. Okay. And then I'm going to use that to create some mountains in the distance. Okay, so they're very blue, but they are slightly warmer. They are slightly leaning toward purple. Okay, And then I'm going to let that wash out down the page also, so that I don't have a hard edge at the bottom of it, okay? Because we're only painting each edge once. And then I can come in and take a little bit more of that color, a tiny bit more concentrated so that it doesn't bleed out as much, and just kind of touch the top edge again. So I want that top edge to be soft, but defined. So it's still wet on wet, but by adding just a little bit more pigment and a little bit less water, I can create that slightly harder edge, but it's still fuzzy, okay? And then blend that out, okay? Now I'm going to transition and do another layer of mountains. So this one's going to have a little bit more pink in it, and it's still wet on wet, okay? Okay, here's my more pink, a little bit warmer, okay? And blend it down. There's kind of my 2 layers of mountains. Maybe I want this one to kind of come up a little bit higher. I don't know. This isn't about necessarily the composition. It's just about the techniques of creating atmospheric perspective. Okay, so then I'm gonna start getting into my middle ground now, okay? Kind of have to decide what I want in my middle ground. So I'm thinking we're gonna go for some muted greens, okay? So I'm gonna take, I don't wanna use a green, I wanna use yellow. Okay, so I'm gonna take my yellow ochre here, which is kind of an orangey yellow, and mix it with my cerulean blue. And then I wanna keep it on the cooler side. And then I'm gonna add just a little bit of my permanent rose to mute it. So it's a green, but it's a muted green, okay? So maybe this is kind of the foothills coming in, right? So they're not as distant, they're a lot closer. And they're not gonna be as jagged, they're a little bit more rolling. Again, the composition doesn't matter that much, okay? And now we're transitioning through that midground toward the foreground. So I'm gonna keep working on warming it up and getting slightly more intense colors and darker values here. So I'm adding more paint, less water. Okay, here's another layer of hills. You see how it's just a little bit warmer. That's bringing it forward. More paint, less water is going to create more edges there. And then as I let this dry a little bit, it's going to create sharper edges as well. So we want to keep that in mind. Okay. Now my foreground here, I'm gonna do kind of a yellow ochre, maybe it's a field of wheat or something, okay? So I'm gonna add my yellow ochre straight to the page, most intense at the front, and then I'm gonna let it bleed and blend up into that foothill, okay? And then that's getting to be a more muted color here because it's got some of the blues and reds from this layer. And see how it's blending, so it's most intense and then it gets less intense and a little lighter value, okay? I'm gonna come back into this middle one here and make sure my brush isn't too wet. And add just a little bit more green here to get that separation from this more blue-green to this more yellow-green. Okay. And then I'm gonna let that blend down into the field a little bit more. Okay, so already you can see that sense of distance just by looking at the temperature changes, okay? This is all still pretty much kind of light to some slight mid values, but I don't have any dark values in there. So we're gonna add some shadows and some dark values toward the foreground to really pull that even more forward. Okay, and then we're gonna look at adding more details as well. So basically it's just gonna be a matter of kind of letting this start to dry. It doesn't have to dry all the way because I'm still gonna want softness in this background. Okay, so I'm gonna mix up a little bit more of that purple, which is my cerulean and my permanent rose. And this is still wet, there's still a sheen to it, but it is sitting there, it's starting to dry. I wanna make sure I don't have too much water on my brush because then it'll just create blooms. And I'm going to add in just a little bit of definition to separate the second layer of mountains from the first layer, okay? And I'm kind of thinking about creating some shadows here too. So these ones, the darker side looked like the left side, so I'm keeping that the same for this next layer. And I'm creating just kind of that subtle difference between the right side and the left side with the shadow. And then I'm blending it down into the green so that there's not a hard transition there. Okay, so that creates that separation. And then I can go in and do the same with some of my more bluey green color that's muted and create that layer of foothills that was more blue and create that separation. And then a little bit more of my yellow green. And here I'm trying to build up a little bit more shadow and depth in that because this is midground now. Okay, so it's gonna have that shadow and that contrast a little bit more. Okay, just kind of touching that in, creating the layer. So you can see it's still bleeding out, but now it's a lot more darker value than the background coming into this midground, and we're having a little bit more contrast. So I'm going to do a little bit of lifting to actually create a little bit even more contrast between the darks and the lights there. Okay, lift out some highlights. There we go. All right, so then as we come into the foreground, we want to start looking at how we can bump up the intensity a little bit and the contrast. So it is just kind of a wheat field, so there's not a ton of things going on here, but I can take some of my yellow ochre, nice thick paint, and then do some textural marks here. Now the page is still wet, so it's not going to stay super, super textured, okay? But I'm starting at the front, and then I'm gonna take some of the paint off and move back in the painting. Okay, and that's gonna make it have a little bit less intensity there of color, lighter value. And I'm just creating various directions of brush strokes here. Okay. So that really is kind of the basics of atmospheric perspective. If I want to create a little bit more, I'll want to add that as the painting dries, because the details won't stay detailed if it's not dry. Okay, so I can add really thick paint. It's not quite dry, but I'm getting impatient, and I'm just gonna add in maybe some little, I think it's called like heads on the wheat, right? Where it's getting that, I don't even know what it's called. I don't know. I'm not a farmer, I'm a painter. But we can add some of those little dots up here to create even more contrast and detail in the front. And I'm just doing that with the smallest amount of cerulean mixed with my yellow ochre, just to create a slightly different color there. And they can kind of look like they're waving. And then we can use really thin lines to create individual pieces of wheat if we let it dry, because we're patient. Okay, so just pulling some of those lines up into the painting, letting it flick out. And as the paint runs out, I'm going to work my way up the painting just a little bit to get some of those textures in toward the back of what I'd still consider the foreground. Okay, this whole field is kind of foreground transition to midground. So we can have a few small details, but they're lower contrast details as we're transitioning back. Okay. So again, this is not meant to be like any sort of masterpiece painting, but this demonstrates atmospheric perspective, shifting from our more details and kind of harder edges. Though really, I don't have a lot of hard edges in here because I'm impatient and didn't wait for it all to dry. But we do have more defined edges up front and less defined in the back. We have our warm to cool temperature shift. We have our higher intensities through our more like neutral mid intensities. And then, our cooler colors that they're still fairly intense with the blues and the purples, but they're the cooler values mixed with the cooler tones mixed with the lighter values makes them appear less intense, even though they are fairly pure pigments and pure colors there. And then we have the value contrasts also. So we have our darkest values and our highest contrast in values from dark to light in the foreground. And then our midground has some contrast, but not as much. And our background has very little contrast. It's really all light value. So basically, I think it's a good idea to kind of practice simple paintings like this. I mean, you could even do it faster than that, just doing 3 layers, and really think about intentionally shifting your colors, your values, your intensities, and your level of detail and edge control through those different layers. And just doing quick paintings like this can help build that memory, that muscle memory, and that habit so that you can really put that into your completed paintings without having to think about it as much. So I hope you really enjoyed this video. Thank you so much for watching it, and go ahead and subscribe to the channel so that you don't miss all of the rest of this series. And again, I have that color theory series already out, so if you want to check that out, the link is down in the description for that playlist. And also subscribe, like, comment, all of those things. Thank you so much for watching. I really appreciate it. I hope you have an awesome rest of your day. And in the meantime, until the next video, keep your paints flowing.